The cruel joke Jefferson High School stood like a proud monument in the suburbs, its red-bricked walls polished by decades of wealth and prestige. The students who walked through its wide hallways carried the weight of privilege on their shoulders. Children of lawyers, doctors, business executives, and professors. The school prided itself on academic excellence, producing some of the brightest students in the state. Yet behind the glossy banners that proclaimed achievement, beneath the polished marble floors, there lay a quieter truth, one that smelled of disinfectant and echoed in the quiet, lonely footsteps of those who were invisible to the eyes of privilege. One of those shadows was Mary Jackson. Mary was not a new face at Jefferson High. For nearly 20 years, she had worked as the school's janitor, her figure often seen bending over a mop or dragging a heavy trash bag down the silent halls. She was an older black woman, her hair sprinkled with gray, her body tired but not broken, and her eyes carrying the weight of years of prejudice. To the teachers, she was background noise. To the students, she was furniture present but unseen. They walked past her with books clutched tightly in their manicured hands, some offering the faintest polite nod, others smirking with an arrogance that was not yet earned but already inherited. Every morning, long before the first student arrived, Mary would unlock the back entrance, push her worn-out cart filled with cleaning supplies, and make her rounds. The smell of bleach clung to her clothes. The sting of ammonia lived in her lungs. Shoe wiped blackboards clean, gathered the crumpled notes students tossed carelessly, and polished the glass trophies displayed in the hall cabinet, the very trophies that celebrated achievements she herself had once dreamed of chasing. Because Mary Jackson was not just a janitor. Once a lifetime ago, she had been a young woman with a sharp mind and an unquenchable hunger for numbers. She had dreamed not of sweeping floors but of solving equations that bent reality of standing before chalkboards, not as a cleaner but as a teacher, a scholar, a mathematician. But dreams, for some, are fragile. Born into a poor family in the segregated streets of Georgia, Mary had always been told she was chasing something impossible. When she won a scholarship to study mathematics at Columbia University, it had felt like a miracle. She had worked twice, as hard as anyone else, battling both equations and cruel whispers. Her brilliance was undeniable, her proofs elegant, her solutions swift. Professors who dared to look past her skin color admired her mind, but classmates rarely did. She endured slurs scratched on her dorm door, icy silences in group discussions, the humiliating dismissal when she asked questions in lecture halls, and just when she thought she could withstand it all, life dealt her another blow. Her father's accident at the factory left her family drowning in medical bills. One semester away from finishing, Mary dropped out to return home, trading chalkboards for cleaning buckets, numbers for night shifts. Decades later, here she was, still carrying that quiet brilliance like an extinguished flame, hidden deep inside, smothered by years of mops, brooms, and prejudice. Most days she kept her head down and her lips sealed. But there were moments rare and fleeting when she would pause in an empty classroom, chalk dust still lingering in the air, and trace an equation left half-finished on the board. Her hand, though calloused, still remembered the rhythm of mathematics. She would whisper the answers to herself before erasing them away, burying her talent under silence once again. On one particular morning, Mary found herself assigned to clean Mr. Mark Anderson's advanced mathematics classroom. Anderson was a man whose name carried weight inside Jefferson's walls. Tall, immaculately dressed, with a square jaw and a permanent smirk. He carried himself with the air of superiority that came not only from his mastery of mathematics, but from the unspoken privilege of his world. Students admired him, not only because he was brilliant, but because he was confident, charming, and cruel in subtle ways. He had no patience for mediocrity, and even less for those he considered beneath him. For years, he had carved out his reputation as Jefferson's star teacher, producing students who went on to Ivy League universities. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, Anderson carried a darker trait: arrogance. His pride was matched only by his disdain for anyone he considered unworthy of intellectual company. Mary entered quietly, pushing her cart into the back of the classroom while Anderson lectured. She had long learned how to make herself invisible, moving silently as the chalk squeaked across the blackboard and the students scribbled in their notebooks. But her very presence was enough to trigger something in Anderson that day. Perhaps it was boredom, perhaps it was ego, or perhaps it was the cruel delight of asserting superiority in front of an audience. Whatever it was, when Mary bent down to pick up a crumpled piece of paper by his shoes, Anderson's eyes gleamed with a malicious thought. "Mary," he said suddenly, his voice slicing through the room like a whip. The class went silent. Heads turned, eyes darted toward the janitor frozen on the floor. Mary straightened slowly, clutching the paper in her hand, her heart thumping uneasily. Anderson's smirk widened. "You've been listening to my lectures all these years, haven't you?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. "Maybe you've learned something. Why don't you come show us your math skills?" The students burst into laughter, their snickers bouncing off the walls. Some whispered cruel jokes about her age, her race, her uniform. Mary felt their gazes pierce her skin like needles. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor, to escape the humiliation pressing down on her chest. But Anderson wasn't finished. "Come now," he goaded, stepping aside from the blackboard where a complex calculus problem sprawled in chalk. "This one stumped even my best students, but who knows? Perhaps you're secretly a genius. Prove me wrong?" The laughter grew louder, but beneath it lay anticipation, every student eager to watch the janitor fail. Mary's hands trembled, the paper crumpling in her fist. For a moment she considered refusing, walking away, swallowing the insult as she had swallowed so many others. But something inside her shifted. A memory stirred a lecture hall at Columbia. A younger Mary scribbling proofs faster than anyone else. Her professor nodding with approval before the world's cruelty stole it all away. She felt the old flame flicker inside her chest. Mary took a deep breath. Her footsteps echoed as she walked slowly to the front of the room. Each step a defiance against the laughter, against the years of invisibility. The students fell silent, their mocking smiles fading into curiosity. Anderson leaned against his desk, arms crossed, convinced he was about to watch her crumble. But Mary Jackson was not going to crumble, not this time. She picked up the chalk, its weight familiar in her hand, and turned toward the problem on the board. The air in the classroom grew thick with silence. Her mind, rusty but not broken, began to move with a rhythm she had long buried. The numbers whispered back to her, like old friends. As her hand began to glide across the board, the world around her disappeared. The hidden genius, the chalk, felt strange in Mary's hand, heavier than she remembered, as if it carried not only the weight of the problem scrawled across the board, but also the years of silence that had buried her talent.
How the board loomed large.
Before her, filled with dense symbols and integrals, an advanced calculus problem designed to test even the brightest students. Mr. Anderson had chosen it precisely for its difficulty. Confident it would be the rope that tightened around her, pride and left her humiliated. Yet as Mary looked at it, her fear melted away, replaced by something else: recognition. Her mind, long accustomed to cleaning schedules and supply checklists, suddenly awakened with a clarity she hadn't felt in decades. Numbers, functions. And the elegant language of mathematics rushed back into her consciousness like a flood bursting through a broken dam. She could almost hear the voice of her old Columbia professor, a kind man with weary eyes, reminding her of the beauty hidden within complex equations. For a brief moment, she wasn't Mary the janitor. Bent under the weight of prejudice and mop handles, she was Mary the student, the scholar, the young woman who had once believed she could solve the world with her mind. The classroom was silent, except for the faint scrape of chalk as she began. At first, the strokes were hesitant, her hand trembling slightly as she wrote. The students leaned forward, expecting her to falter, to stop midway, to expose herself as an imposter. Even Anderson's smirk widened, assured she would soon crumble under the weight of expectation. But Mary did not stop. Her hand grew steadier, her pace more confident. Each line of chalk revealed another step, each symbol connecting seamlessly to the next. The solution unfolded not with uncertainty, but with elegance. Her logic clear, her process flawless. Gasps began to ripple through the room. A few students exchanged stunned glances, their mocking grins replaced by disbelief. One of the top students, a boy named Jonathan, who prided himself on his near-perfect math scores, leaned forward in his seat, eyes narrowing as he followed her work. His lips parted slightly as realization dawned. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't stumbling. She was solving it cleanly and confidently, as if the problem were nothing more than a warm-up exercise. Anderson's smirk faltered. He shifted in his seat, his arms uncrossing as he leaned toward the board, trying to catch an error. But there was no error. Mary's handwriting was clear, deliberate, and every step flowed into the next like a symphony. She didn't pause, didn't backtrack, didn't hesitate. For years, she had cleaned chalkboards without thought, wiping away the work of others. Now, for the first time in decades, she was filling one with her own brilliance. Her mind began to wander as her hand moved, memories intertwining with equations. She was 19 again, standing in front of a crowded lecture hall at Columbia. She had been asked to demonstrate a proof by induction. And though her hands had trembled back then too, she had finished to the stunned applause of her professor. She remembered the pride, the feeling of being seen not as a black girl from a poor neighborhood, but as a mathematician. But then she remembered the cruel words scrawled on her dorm door the next morning. "Go home. You don't belong here." She had scrubbed them away with tears in her eyes. The same way she now scrubbed Jefferson's floors every day, her chalk hit the final step. She circled the solution with a firm hand and placed the chalk back on the ledge. For a moment, silence reigned, thick and heavy. The entire room stared at the board, at the complete and flawless solution to a problem that had defeated even the school's brightest. Jonathan was the first to speak, his voice barely more than a whisper. She got it right. The words rippled through the classroom, breaking the silence. Murmurs erupted, disbelief tangled with awe. Students craned their necks to look at the board again, some standing to verify what their eyes refused to believe. One girl whispered, "No way. How did she do that?" Another muttered, "That's the exact method from the textbook." She didn't miss a single step. Anderson's face was a mask of disbelief, the color draining from his cheeks. His arrogance had been shaken, his authority undermined in front of his entire class. He stood abruptly, clearing his throat as if to reclaim control. "Lucky guess," he said dismissively, though his voice betrayed unease. Anyone could have stumbled. On to the solution. But even as he spoke, he knew the words rang hollow. Mary hadn't stumbled. She had soared. Her precision was unmistakable, the kind of clarity only someone truly gifted could display. Mary turned slowly, her gaze sweeping the room. She saw the wide eyes, the parted lips, the stunned expressions of those who had spent years dismissing her as invisible. For once, she wasn't invisible. For once, the laughter had stopped. Part of her wanted to smile, to savor the moment, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had lived too long with humility to gloat now. Still, deep inside her chest, something stirred, a flicker of pride she had long buried. She had shown them. She had reminded herself of who she once was, who she still could be. The bell rang. Suddenly, startling everyone, signaling the end of class. Students spilled out of their seats, but instead of rushing for the door, they lingered, whispering to each other, their eyes still darting toward Mary. Word was already spreading. It just happened in Anderson's classroom was too shocking to keep contained. By the end of the day, every hallway in Jefferson High would buzz with the story. The janitor had solved the impossible problem. Anderson dismissed the students stiffly, his voice sharp, his authority cracking at the edges. "Yes." As they filed out, he turned to Mary, his expression unreadable. There was no gratitude, no acknowledgement. Only a mixture of anger, humiliation, and something else he couldn't name, fear. Without a word, he turned his back on her, busying himself with his papers, as though she no longer existed. Mary lowered her gaze and stepped away from the board. The classroom felt heavier now, the silence different than before. She placed the chalk back carefully, as if it were a fragile treasure, and gathered her cart. As she pushed it out into the hallway, she could already hear the whispers trailing behind her. For the first time in 2 decades, Mary Jackson was no longer invisible, but she had no idea that this single moment, this act of quiet defiance, would set into motion a chain of events that would shake Jefferson High to its very core, forcing students, teachers, and even herself to confront truths long buried under prejudice and pride. The school divides the day after Mary Jackson solved the impossible calculus problem. Jefferson High School no longer felt the same. The building, with its spotless floors and banners of academic achievement, carried a strange energy. Hallways that once echoed with routine chatter now buzzed with whispers, every corner carrying fragments of the same story. Students leaned against lockers, heads bent together, their voices hushed yet electric with disbelief. Some recounted every detail with awe, embellishing her confidence at the board as though it were a scene out of legend. Others laughed nervously, unwilling to admit that the janitor had done something none of them could. The tale spread beyond the classroom, beyond the students, reaching the ears of teachers, staff, and eventually the principal. Mary noticed the difference immediately. For years, she had moved through Jefferson's halls unseen, her cart rattling behind her as if she were nothing more than background noise. But now, when she entered a classroom to collect trash, conversation stopped abruptly. Eyes followed her, and murmurs rose in her wake. Some students stared at her with admiration, whispering words like genius and brilliant. Others avoided her gaze, embarrassed by their laughter the day before. A few even smirked bitterly, clinging to their prejudice like armor, muttering that it must have been luck or a trick. The teachers were no better. Mrs. Reynolds from the English department nodded politely when Mary passed. Acknowledging her presence, Mr. Green, the chemistry teacher, stopped her in the hall to say, "Impressive work yesterday, Mary," though his tone carried both surprise and unease, as though he were struggling to reconcile the janitor with the mathematician. Yet others, especially those who prided themselves on their academic authority, reacted with subtle hostility. To them, Mary's brilliance was not an inspiration, but a disruption. A challenge to the unspoken hierarchy that kept people like her in the background. Mr. Anderson, however, was the most shaken. He walked through the halls with his usual crisp stride. But those who knew him well noticed the stiffness in his jaw, the clipped tone in his voice. In the teacher's lounge, when the topic inevitably surfaced, he dismissed it curtly. "Got lucky," he said with a forced laugh. "Even a broken clock is right twice a day." But no matter how he tried to downplay it, the memory of her flawless solution burned in his mind. Every line she had written, every step she had taken, had been perfect. There had been no guessing, no hesitation. Deep down, he knew she hadn't been lucky, she had been brilliant. That realization unsettled him in ways he couldn't admit. For Mary, the sudden attention was overwhelming. She had lived so long in the shadows that the weight of so many eyes felt suffocating. As she pushed her cart down the halls, she could hear the whispers, some admiring, some mocking. She wanted to tell them all it didn't matter, that she was just a janitor, that her time had passed. Yet part of her heart, long dormant, stirred with something dangerous. Hope. That evening, as the school emptied and silence fell over the building, Mary found herself pausing once again in Mr. Anderson's classroom. The chalkboard still bore faint traces of the problem she had solved, the dust of her triumph lingering like a ghost. She picked up a piece of chalk almost unconsciously, her hand trembling as she wrote another equation across the board. Her body remembered the rhythm, her mind the patterns. Within minutes, the board was covered with calculations, elegant and precise. When she stepped back, she realized she had been holding her breath. Tears slid down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away. She had hidden her brilliance for so long, buried it under years of silence, but now it threatened to break free as she cleaned the board. Her thoughts wandered back to Columbia, to her days as a young student full of fire. She remembered walking into classrooms filled with young men who stared at her as though she were an intruder. Professors who praised her brilliance in private but ignored her in public, afraid to confront the prejudice of their wealthy donors. She remembered late nights in the library, her notebooks filled with intricate proofs, her mind soaring above the cruelty of her classmates. And she remembered the day everything collapsed, the telegram that her father had been injured in the factory, the unpaid bills, the painful decision to leave behind her dreams. She had walked away from mathematics not because she had failed, but because life had forced her to. And now, decades later, that old wound ached once again. The following week, the principal called her into the office. Mary stood nervously outside the door, her hands clutching the handle of her mop as if it were a shield. She expected reprimand. Perhaps Anderson had complained. Perhaps the school wanted to remind her of her place. But when she entered, Principal Harris greeted her with a warm, if slightly uncertain, smile. "Mary," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "I've heard quite a lot about what happened in Mr. Anderson's class." Mary lowered her eyes, her voice quiet. "I didn't mean to cause trouble, sir," he asked me, and I just... Harris raised a hand. "No trouble. Quite the opposite. What you did has inspired a lot of students. Some of them are even asking if you'd be willing to help with their math outside class." Mary froze, her heart thudding. "Me? Help students?" "Yes," Harris said firmly. "Some of our kids struggle with advanced math, and they look up to what you did. If you're willing, I'd like to arrange for you to tutor them a few afternoons each week. It won't interfere with your duties, and of course we'll compensate you for the extra work." Mary's throat tightened. Wanted to say yes. Wanted to grasp the chance to touch mathematics again, but fear held her back. She had spent decades reminding herself that her dreams were gone, that her place was in the shadows. Could she really step into the light again? "I'll think about it," she whispered. That night, as she sat at her kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, she stared at the worn notebook she had kept hidden for years, filled with scribbled equations. From her youth, her fingers traced the faded ink, her heart caught between resignation and longing. She thought of the student's eyes, wide with awe, and of the younger version of herself who had once dared to dream. Slowly, painfully, she realized the truth. She couldn't bury her gift forever. The following week, she returned to the principal's office and gave her answer. "Yes, I'll do it." But Mary didn't know that by saying yes, she was stepping into a storm. Her decision would inspire many, but it would also provoke resentment from those unwilling to see her as anything more than a janitor. Jefferson High was about to become a battleground, divided between admiration and prejudice, and Mary Jackson was at the center. Breaking barriers the first afternoon, Mary Jackson agreed to tutor. She stood in the empty classroom long before the students arrived, her hands trembling as she arranged the chalk, the erasers, and the textbooks that had been pulled from the school library for her use. The sunlight slanted through the tall windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air, and the room felt alive with memory. It was the same classroom she had cleaned countless times, bending over rows of desks, wiping away chalk dust from lessons she was never meant to be part of. Now, for the first time in decades, she was standing at the board not as a janitor, but as a teacher. The thought alone made her chest tighten with both excitement and dread. When the first students walked in, their faces carried a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. Jonathan, the bright boy from Anderson's class, who had been among the first to recognize her brilliance, entered with his notebook clutched tightly. His eyes shining with an eagerness he barely tried to hide. Behind him came Emma, a shy girl who often struggled with math, but whose face now carried a flicker of hope. Then came Marcus, a football player who had always treated math as an enemy, but had heard the whispers that the janitor had done what even Anderson could not. Soon, half a dozen students filled the room, their voices low, their eyes darting between Mary and the chalkboard. Mary's heart pounded, but she forced herself to smile. "Good afternoon," she said softly, her voice trembling at first but gaining steadiness with each word. "I'm not here to replace your teachers. I'm just here to help. Math can be hard, but it's also beautiful, and if you give it a chance, you might find it speaks to you in ways you didn't expect." At first, the students were cautious. They whispered among themselves, unsure of how to act in this strange, new dynamic. But as Mary picked up the chalk and began to explain a problem, breaking it down slowly, patiently, without condescension, their skepticism melted into engagement. She didn't lecture them the way Anderson did, with sharp commands. and expectations of perfection. Instead, she guided them gently, asking questions, letting them try, encouraging them when they faltered. For Emma, she drew diagrams and used metaphors that made abstract concepts tangible. For Marcus, she tied equations to the trajectory of a football, showing him that numbers weren't enemies but allies, hidden in the arc of a pass. For Jonathan, she posed advanced challenges, smiling with pride when his eyes lit up with discovery. By the time the session ended, the room was filled with energy, the kind that comes not from memorization, but from genuine understanding. Students gathered their things. Jonathan turned to Mary, his voice filled with sincerity. "You're the best teacher I've ever had." The words struck Mary like lightning, filling her with a warmth she had not felt in years. She smiled, but deep down she feared what such praise might stir in others. Her fears proved correct. Next day, in the teacher's lounge, Mr. Anderson's voice rose above the clatter of coffee cups and murmurs. "It's ridiculous," he scoffed, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "A janitor tutoring math? What's next? Are we going to let the cafeteria staff teach chemistry?" Mrs. Reynolds frowned but said nothing while Mr. Green tried to interject. "Mark, the students are responding well. Maybe it's not such a bad thing." Anderson's eyes flashed with anger. "It undermines everything this school stands for. We have degrees, years of training, credentials. She has... What a mop! You can't just hand over authority to someone like her. It's a mockery of the profession." His words carried more than professional jealousy. They dripped with prejudice. Anderson couldn't bear the thought that someone he had tried to humiliate had outshone him in the very field he claimed to dominate. But beyond that, he couldn't accept the idea that a black woman in a janitor's uniform might be more gifted than he was. The faculty began to divide. Some, like Green, saw Mary's tutoring as a blessing, a way to reach struggling students. Others sided with Anderson, convinced that allowing her to step beyond her janitorial duties was a threat to the school's order. The whispers of the students only fueled the tension, for they spoke openly now of how Mary explained things better than their teachers, how she made math feel alive instead of intimidating. Mary, unaware of the full extent of the battle brewing around her, continued her tutoring sessions with quiet dedication. Each afternoon, more students joined. What had begun as 6 soon grew to 10, then 15. The classroom buzzed with energy, filled with laughter, concentration, and the scrape of pencils as problems were solved with newfound clarity. For the first time, students who had once feared mathematics looked forward to it. Some even began staying late, eager for just a few more minutes under Mary's guidance. Yet not all the attention was positive. One afternoon, as Mary walked home carrying her worn bag filled with old notebooks, she heard footsteps behind her. A group of students trailed her, whispering and laughing cruelly. "Hey, genius janitor," one sneered, his voice laced with mockery. "Think you're too good for the mop now?" They burst into laughter, the sound chasing her down the street. Mary quickened her pace, her chest tight, fighting back tears. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, her hands trembling as she opened her old notebooks. The pages, yellowed with age, were filled with proofs and equations, the remnants of the dreams she had once carried. She wanted to close them, to bury the pain again. But then she thought of Emma's bright eyes, of Marcus's grin, when he finally solved a problem, of Jonathan's words, "You're the best teacher I've ever had." Slowly, she steadied herself. She had endured decades of prejudice. She would endure this too. But the greatest challenge came when the principal summoned her once more. Harris looked weary, his face lined with the strain of balancing admiration and controversy. "Mary," he began gently, "I want to be honest with you. What you're doing is remarkable, and the students are thriving, but some of the faculty are resistant. They believe this isn't your place, that it sets a dangerous precedent." Mary lowered her gaze, her voice quiet. "I never wanted to cause trouble. I just wanted to help." "I know," Harris said softly. "I know support you, but you need to be prepared. There will be pushback. People like Anderson feel threatened, and they won't let this go easily." Mary nodded slowly. She had lived her whole life under the weight of prejudice. This was nothing new. But now, for the first time, she wasn't just fighting for herself, was fighting for the students who had placed their trust in her. As the weeks passed, the tension grew. Anderson began setting his students deliberately difficult assignments, sneering when they admitted they had sought Mary's help. He criticized her in the lounge, in meetings, even in subtle comments during class. Yet no matter how hard he tried to discredit her, the truth could not be erased. Mary Jackson was breaking barriers. She was no longer just the janitor in the background. She was a teacher, a mentor, and for many, an inspiration. And soon, her quiet revolution would spread beyond tutoring sessions. For one day, requests came from the principal that would thrust her into the spotlight once more. To represent Jefferson High in a regional math competition, guiding a team of students who had once struggled, but now, under her care, had grown confident and strong. Mary's heart raced at the thought. She wanted to refuse, to retreat back into the safety of invisibility. But when she looked into the eyes of her students who now saw her not as a janitor but as a guide, she knew she could not step back. She had carried silence for too long. It was time to let her voice and her gift be heard. And so, the janitor who had been mocked and humiliated was about to step onto a stage no one ever imagined for her. Carrying not only her own dreams but the hopes of every student she had inspired. The final equation, the weeks leading up to the regional mathematics competition, were unlike anything Jefferson High had experienced before. For years, the school had sent teams made up of its brightest students, children of professors, engineers, and scientists who were drilled under the stern supervision of teachers like Mr. Anderson. Yet this year, a change swept through the school's atmosphere. Instead of Anderson leading a polished group of elite students, the team bore the influence of someone no one had expected, Mary Jackson, the janitor who had once been invisible. Every afternoon, after her regular duties were finished, Mary gathered her small team in the same classroom where her journey had begun. Jonathan, Emma, Marcus, and 3 other students sat in the front row with notebooks open, their eyes filled with anticipation. Mary stood at the board, chalk in hand, guiding them through problem after problem. What set her apart was not only her deep knowledge but the patience and empathy she infused into every lesson. Where Anderson barked orders and belittled mistakes, Mary encouraged curiosity, celebrating small breakthroughs as though they were great victories. Under her care, the students flourished. Jonathan, once arrogant in his own brilliance, learned humility and teamwork. Emma, who had always trembled at the sight of equations, grew confident enough to solve complex problems in front of her peers. Marcus, the football player, discovered that the same determination that carried him through grueling practices could also push him to master algebraic proofs. The team began to believe in themselves, and more importantly, they began to believe in Mary. But not everyone shared that faith. Anderson grew colder by the day, watching from the sidelines as whispers spread through the school that Mary was achieving what he could not. In the faculty lounge, he dismissed the idea of her leading the competition team. "It's absurd," he scoffed, his voice sharp. "They'll embarrass us. She's no teacher. She's a custodian with delusions of grandeur." Yet even as he spoke, there was an edge of desperation in his tone, for he sensed his authority slipping. The day of the competition arrived with crisp autumn air and a nervous energy that swept through the school. Jefferson High's team gathered at the auditorium, dressed in matching blazers, their notebooks clutched tightly. Mary walked among them quietly, her uniform plain, her shoes worn, but her presence grounding them. She felt the weight of decades pressing on her shoulders, yet she also felt a quiet strength rising within. This was not about her pride anymore. It was about giving her students the chance she had once lost. The auditorium buzzed with energy. Teams from prestigious schools across the district filled the room, their mentors polished and confident, their students rehearsed and disciplined. When Jefferson High's group entered, guided by the janitor, heads turned. Whispers spread quickly. "Is that their coach? And isn't she the custodian?" Some laughed openly, shaking their heads at the apparent absurdity. Mary felt their stares like knives, but she kept her gaze steady. reminding herself of the students who looked to her for courage. The competition began. Problem after problem flashed across the board. Students scribbled furiously, whispering to one another, their hands moving with urgency. Under Mary's guidance, Jefferson's team approached the challenges with calm focus. Jonathan tackled advanced calculus, his pencil flying as Mary's earlier lessons echoed in his mind. Emma took on geometry, her once timid voice now steady as she explained her reasoning to the team. Marcus handled probability, his confidence unshakable as he connected concepts to real-world scenarios Mary had taught him. Each student contributed, their strengths weaving together into something greater than the sum of its parts. By the midpoint of the competition, Jefferson High, once dismissed as an underdog, was tied with the leading school. The audience buzzed with shock. Teachers whispered in disbelief. Anderson, seated stiffly in the back, clenched his fists. He could not accept that the janitor he had tried to humiliate was leading the school toward victory. The final problem appeared on the board, a monstrous equation designed to test not only skill, but endurance. The teams bent over their papers, sweat beading on brows, pencils scratching furiously. Jefferson's students froze for a moment, their confidence wavering under the weight of the challenge. Mary stepped closer, her voice low but steady. "Remember what I told you," she whispered. "Every problem, no matter how big, is just a series of smaller steps. Don't stare at the mountain. Take one step, then another. Trust yourselves." Her words calmed them, and slowly they began to work. Jonathan broke the problem into smaller parts. Emma handled the diagrams. Marcus calculated probabilities, and the others filled in the missing links. Together, they pieced the solution like a puzzle, their hands steadying as Mary guided them not with answers but with faith. As the buzzer rang, Jefferson High submitted their solution with seconds to spare. Silence filled the auditorium as the judges reviewed the papers, their brows furrowed, and one by one they nodded, their eyes widening in recognition. The announcer stepped to the microphone, his voice booming. "The winner of this year's regional mathematics competition, Jefferson High School." The auditorium erupted into gasps and applause. Students leaped from their seats, cheering while Jefferson's team hugged one another, their faces alight with joy. Emma burst into tears. Jonathan pumped his fist in the air. Marcus lifted his teammates off the ground in celebration. And in the midst of it all, Mary stood quietly, her hands trembling, tears glistening in her eyes. For the first time in decades, she was not invisible. She was not the janitor sweeping floors in the shadows. She was the woman who had believed in her students when no one else did. The woman who had turned mockery into triumph. As the applause thundered, Principal Harris stepped onto the stage, his voice breaking with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, today Jefferson High has achieved something extraordinary. And it would not have been possible without the guidance of someone whose brilliance has too long been hidden. Please join me in recognizing Mary Jackson." Crowd rose to its feet, a standing ovation that echoed through the auditorium. Mary's chest tightened as wave after wave of applause washed over her. She shook her head, overwhelmed, but Harris gently guided her forward. She stepped onto the stage, her uniform plain, but her presence radiant. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to stand in the light, in the back of the room. Anderson sat rigid, his face pale, his pride shattered. For years he had built his reputation on arrogance and superiority, yet in a single act, Mary had undone him not with anger, not with force, but with quiet brilliance and humility. He lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. When the ovation finally subsided, Mary spoke, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "I am not a teacher by title. I'm not a scholar with degrees hanging on my wall. I am just someone who loves mathematics and believes that every student deserves a chance to see its beauty. For years, I let the world convince me I had no place here, but I was wrong. We all have gifts, no matter where life takes us, and it is never too late to use them." Her words hung in the air, powerful and undeniable. The students who had once mocked her now looked at her with respect. Teachers who had dismissed her shifted uneasily, realizing the depth of their prejudice. And for the young black students, in the crowd who had long felt invisible themselves, Mary's presence was more than inspiration. It was proof that they, too, could rise. That evening, as Mary walked home, she passed the empty classrooms she had cleaned for so many years. The hallways were quiet, the trophies glinting faintly in the dim light, yet everything felt different. For decades, she had been the unseen hands that polished those trophies, erased those boards, scrubbed those floors. Now, in her heart, she knew she had become something more. She had left her mark not on the tiles or the windows, but on the lives of the students who would carry her lessons forward. She unlocked her door, sat at her kitchen table, and opened her old notebooks. The faded ink no longer felt like the relic of a broken dream. It felt like a promise one she had finally kept. As she traced the equations, she smiled through her tears, whispering to herself words she had not dared to believe for years. I am still a mathematician, and for the first time since she was 19 years old, Mary Jackson felt whole.